From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
This election needs a bit of gingering up. Thus far, it is the dullest, most boring election campaign we have ever seen in our lives.
At the start of a new week of campaigning, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak suffered what military types call a double tap.
I have decided. I've changed my mind.
Mid-afternoon Monday, Nigel Farage seized control of Reform UK, pronounced himself leader and a candidate.
So I am going to stand in this election in the Essex seaside town of Clacton.
That was strike one. Then, late afternoon, YouGov unveiled an MRP poll, one of these large sample polls which tries to predict constituency by constituency results. And it suggested the Prime Minister would be kneecapped, Tory voters bleeding left, but also right, pushed into third in some seats by Reform.
Hello, Grant chaps. You're live on Sky News. I'm in the studio with Sophie Ridge. Have you just seen that you're about to lose your seat according to the Sky News YouGov projection? You just put the phone down on me.
The story today, the Tories' worst nightmare. Nigel's back.
I'm Harry Yorke. I'm the Deputy Political Editor of The Sunday Times.
Mondays are your day off.
They are, yes.
What were you up to?
I was in the garden, actually. I was tackling some thorn bushes, edging my lawn, the kind of normal things that a kind of middle-aged person would do, but maybe not a 30-year-old.
As is your right on a Monday, though, when it's your day off. When did you get wind that something was afoot in Farage land?
Well, I got a load of text messages, kind of excited text messages from a number of fellow journalists and also a few people that I know in the party saying Farage is going to stand, which was news to me because a few days beforehand I'd been sat in a working men's club with him in Skegness and I'd asked him repeatedly, are you going to stand? And I know you said you're not standing, but yeah, I read a piece that Matt Goodman wrote. He'd be thrilled if he did stand. Is it definitely a hard no?
I've said no.
Yeah. And he was quite categorical that he wasn't. So, yeah, it was a bit of a surprise, but part of me always suspected that there was more to come with Farage, and I could just tell that something was afoot.
So you took your gardening gloves off, I imagine. Trowel was down, and what, did you go and watch it on the telly when it finally happened at 4?
I watched it on the TV, yeah, but I have to say I was very committed to the gardening. So I watched it, I kept on top of Twitter, but, I had some thorn bushes to tackle, so.
There are many people who say, who cares what Farage is doing? Why are we taking this announcement from him live and all the rest of it? Was it a big moment, do you think?
It's a huge moment, and we shouldn't understate how important it is. And we should be focusing on it because in the context of right-wing politics in this country, Nigel Farage coming back to the front line at a time when the Tories are already on course to lose hundreds of seats is a big moment. And the reason why it's a big moment is because the Conservative Party is at a real crossroads right now. And I talked and wrote about this at the weekend. And there's lots of people in the party who think that Farage should be back in the Conservative fold after 32 years out of it. That moment has come and gone, right? They have lost the moment. The opportunity to lance the Farage boil is over. And now you have a situation where he is probably at the height of his recognition in terms of public recognition and maybe even popularity because of what he did with I'm a Celebrity. So he's now more well-known amongst young people who watch that programme. People have seen a different side to him and maybe come to slightly different conclusions about him. But more importantly than all of that is I think now that we know he's standing in Clacton-on-Sea, I think he probably stands the best chance he's ever had of being elected. And bearing in mind he has stood for Parliament 7 times before. But the reason why he has a much greater chance now, I think, is because in the past he has been beaten because the Conservative polling has been high and he's been losing to Tories in safe seats. But this time round, with the polling so low for the Conservatives, you just feel that a lot of Conservative voters who in the past would maybe be quite receptive to Farage as a personality, but think, I'm going to stick with the Conservatives because, there's a prospect of Labour getting in. That argument's kind of over now. Labour, according to the polls, are going to win the next election by a very, very large margin. And therefore, I think some of those people will just think, right, well, now's the time to cast my vote for Farage. So with all those things considered, I think he does stand a very, very good chance of winning in Clacton-on-Sea.
This has really become your beat now. As much as our colleague Jane Mulkerrins is the Stormy Daniels whisperer, I think you are the Nigel Farage whisperer now.
Oh, God.
And as you mentioned, you were out and about with him in Skegness last week, or however many days ago it was. He was out there campaigning. What did you see there that made you think Farage is at the height of his powers, as you explained?
Well, I'll just set the scene a little bit. Okay, so we get to Skegness. Farage is running an hour late, typically. So I've been with Richard Tice earlier in the day. I did an interview with him.
Richard Tice, at that point, leader.
At that point, he was the leader of Reform, yes.
Yeah.
So I did an interview with him in nearby Boston, because Tice is standing in Boston and Skegness. And then we were supposed to go on this battle bus from Boston to Skegness, but Farage was massively delayed, so we had to make our way to Skegness. Anyway, the reason why I say this is because we're stood outside of an ice cream parlour where Tice and Farage are doing their PR. Their PR's done, the broadcasters are gathered there. And Farage rocks up, and he turns up with this army he's got about 6 or 7 bodyguards. He's got an army of aides and supporters with him. So he's got his entire entourage, and it's kind of like the red carpet treatment.
It's like Kim Kardashian turning.
Well, exactly. And you've got the party's own photographers, they're doing social media. So you've got this huge hype around him, and people obviously down the street in Skegness, they all see him and think, oh, it's Nigel Farage. So there was just this huge hive of activity going on. And then I turned to my left, and Richard Tice is walking up the street. This is, as you say, the leader of Reform. Richard Tice is on his own, and he quietly walks up, and then they both greet. But I just thought the contrast was just so astonishing. You know, you've got this leader of the party who turns up on his own, and then he's walking towards a guy that's being swamped already. And the optics were really eyebrow-raising.
And you must have been thinking even at that point, so this was obviously days before the announcement that Farage ended up making, that he must surely stand. I know he said he hasn't, but this is where the political magic is, if there is, in that party. Look,
I had to take him at his word. He told me on the record he wasn't standing. But I tell you why I was deeply sceptical of what he'd said. Because 5 months ago, it was in January, and I was going about my day-to-day stuff as a reporter, and I got a phone call, and it was Aaron Banks, who is one of Farage's close allies. He used to bankroll UKIP and Farage for years, leave the EU. And he called me up and he said, look, Harry, I've got a great story for you. I've done some private polling in Clacton-on-Sea. I've polled if Nigel were to stand there, and I think you'd be very interested in results. So he sends me over the polling, and it shows that Farage would have won by 37 points, and the Conservative candidate, Giles Watling, the current MP, was down on 27. And Banks said, I think you should call Nigel. I bet he'll be very interested in what we found. So I called Farage up, and his response was, this poll makes me more likely than I've ever been to get back on the pitch. And part of me, just reading between the lines, thought, something's going on here. Why has Banks paid a load of money to do this polling? Clearly him and Farage have been talking about Clacton-on-Sea. There's something afoot. But then obviously we had this situation last week where Farage was saying, I've been caught on the hoof by the snap election. I don't have time. I've got this gig going on in America.
This, therefore, must be the most propitious set of circumstances for you to be an MP. Why did you bottle it? Why didn't you run?
I've never bottled anything. I mean, of all the people you've interviewed over the years, I think I've stood up more against the establishment, taken more abuse than anybody you've ever talked to. So bottling it's not true.
And then as we got to Skegness, there were two things that increased my view that he was going to stand. The first was that earlier in the day, a pollster called Matthew Goodwin, who's kind of like the Reform whisperer, he had written a blog post saying that he thought Farage was going to stand in Clacton-on-Sea after all, and he was reconsidering, and he had massive regrets about calling it too early. And then whilst we were going around Skegness, it's not an understatement to say, bearing in mind that Boston and Skegness is the highest Leave voting seat in the country, that Farage was basically being mobbed by people.
Hello. Excuse me, young man.
Hello, all right.
And there's not many others Nigels left.
Oh, bad luck.
No,
There were people shouting out his name. We had this bizarre situation where 3 young teenagers wearing high-vis pink jackets were chanting and following him around the street.
What were they chanting?
Just Nigel Farage, Nigel Farage. It was hilarious, but also surreal. And everybody that we were speaking to, and I went off and spoke privately to people after he had interacted with them, and I said, well, are you thinking of voting for reform? Most of them were. And then I asked, and are you disappointed that Nigel Farage isn't standing? And all of them said, yes, he should be standing. And I think they imparted that message to Farage too.
Yes.
And in fact, he actually referenced it when he was explaining why he changed his mind.
But the other thing that really shook me in a way last week were the number of people coming up to me on the street saying, Nigel, why aren't you standing? And I gave my logical, rational reasons for it. But I couldn't help, after each exchange, I simply couldn't help feeling somehow they felt I was letting them down.
We finally got to sit down and he buys a pint and we start the interview. And I did ask him repeatedly, I said, look, there's a lot of people that seem to be suggesting you're going to stand. And at that point, his aide kind of interjected and whispered, he's not standing. And then Farage said, I've said no. I think I can do more doing what I'm doing. So you think you can have more impact rather than being stuck in the constituency?
Without a doubt. Look what I've been doing. Raising issues and debates. But, actually have a serious conversation, hear, question time, press conference. I've been doing a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
It's been a crazy few days.
I had to kind of take him at his word, but I left definitely feeling that something was afoot, but what it was, I just couldn't quite work out.
Why do you think he's now finally decided, now is my time?
Well, for the reasons that I outlined a bit earlier about the polling, showing that he's probably got the best chance he's ever going to have. To answer your first point, I don't know, and he'll probably kick off for me saying this, but I don't actually think Nigel Farage is too bothered about being an MP. I think he feels it is a requirement for him to be an MP. I think what Nigel Farage wants to do is be front and centre at all times to dominate the conversation. And to be honest, I think he wants to lead a party. That's what he wants to do, and you have to be on the pitch to lead. But yeah, to answer your question, I think he has to be seen to be standing, and he probably will win now as a result.
It was an interesting afternoon that day, the start of this week of campaigning, because not only did we have that announcement from Farage, but then 2 hours, an hour later, one of these big MRP polls, this one from YouGov, dropped, one of these large sample ones that tries to look at what might happen constituency by constituency and then draw conclusions from that. And that showed quite a dramatic picture for what could happen after the election. And Reform's place in that is interesting.
Well, it's interesting because, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think that MRP doesn't show them winning any seats right now, which I think is really intriguing because I think Farage coming back and being the leader and standing could change that equation. Because, as you say, I've written about Reform repeatedly over the last few years and certainly in the last 6 months. And I've spoken to a lot of pollsters, and what they all say is that Farage being back on the pitch could give Reform an extra 5 points in the polls. Reform thinks they could get between 5 and 10. I actually asked Farage on Friday, what does success look like at this election? And he said, we need to be on 18 points. Currently they're around 12 to 15. And the reason why they need to be on 18 is because Reform refer to something called a tipping point, which is when they're currently, expected to win about 4 million to 5 million votes. That's kind of what UKIP was getting. But once you get to 6 million, to 18 points, then in some of those seats that they've fallen short on in the past, they tip over. And through the first past the post system, they win those seats. So that's his goal. And Farage being the leader could seriously deliver that.
Harry, we're talking Nigel Farage. He is back. He's standing for Parliament. He's leading his latest party. But unlike previous Nigel Farage apparitions, he has taken off the table a deal with the Tories. And that's something that he and his gang have done in the past and been burned by. when it was part of the Brexit Party in 2019. What did they do and how did it go?
So what happened in 2019 is Boris Johnson had got his Brexit deal and he was making the entire election almost like another referendum.
Oven ready deal. Slam it in. Get Brexit done. Yes, that's ready. We get it out by Christmas. We're out of the EU.
Vote for the Conservatives and we will deliver Brexit. If you vote for Labour, you're going to have a second referendum and potentially the Leave vote cancelled out. But the problem that the Tories had, even though Johnson was polling pretty high and could have won, is that Farage was back on the scene, and whereas the Conservatives had rallied behind Johnson's Brexit deal, Farage was slamming it, saying it wasn't going to work.
When he says we're going to leave on the 31st of October, I hope he's right, but I just don't see how.
They had a problem there because they needed to unite the Brexit vote again. All of those millions of voters who voted for Brexit, they had to vote Tory for it to work. So what happened is you had this extraordinary thing going on behind the scenes where a guy called Dougie Smith, who most people have never heard of, but is the behind-the-scenes fixer for the Conservative Party.
Those of us who read Nadine Dorris's book will know who he is.
Yes, those large numbers of people who read Nadine Dorris's book. Yeah. So Dougie Smith set to work behind the scenes with a few other people trying to convince Farage to stand down. And he's talked about in the past that he was offered peerages. The Conservative Party disputes this, but there was definitely some horse trading or attempted horse trading. The culmination of that, you ended up with this decision that Farage announced quite sensationally, where he said that they were going to stand down in every single seat the Conservative Party was standing in.
Sensationally and unilaterally.
And unilaterally. And that's really interesting, and partly it informs why they are not doing so this time around. Because whilst the Conservative Party was absolutely cock-a-hoop of that announcement, there were lots of people in the Brexit Party, senior people who were standing, who had been stood down, and they were very unhappy. And then very senior people who had put their all into the Brexit Party for years, who felt it was a huge betrayal, and they weren't consulted, and it was a Farage decision hoisted on them. So when Farage stepped aside again after the 2019 election and Tice took over, Tice made some very, very firm binding assurances to very senior people in the party, the likes of Anne Widdecombe and a guy called Ben Habib, who's deputy leader. In order for them to come back and join what was now Reform, he guaranteed that they would never do another deal with the Conservatives. So that obviously makes a second deal this time around very difficult. But I think actually just from speaking to Farage himself, the sense I get is that he feels slightly embarrassed actually, because he was basically saying in 2019, I am telling you, Brexit Party voters, that you can put your trust in Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party to get Brexit done. Now, they did, but Farage now says that everything that he hoped for from Brexit has not come to pass. So he feels that his credibility is on the line and he cannot be seen again to basically vacate the pitch and let the Tories have a clean run at it.
There are no circumstances whatsoever. We have been betrayed by a Conservative Party that I gave considerable help to back in 2019, and boy, did I. I got rid of Mrs May by forming the Brexit Party, and they had their most crushing defeat in 200 years. I stood aside in over 300 seats for Boris Johnson, and we were told that we get control of our borders. We were told the immigration numbers would come down. They have exploded. So I feel betrayed by them, and what I am trying to do is to establish a voice of opposition to what is going to be a Labour government that otherwise might be out of control.
If you are elected to Parliament. And is the part of it as well, which was that in 2019, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were relatively buoyant. Now, I guess Farage can smell blood.
Totally. We've got to remember that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, with the exception of Rishi Sunak, probably the two most recognised politicians in Britain.
Yeah.
And they share something else, which is a killer opportunistic instinct. And there's no way, I think, that hasn't factored into Farage's thinking, the fact that he's never going to get this better shot at taking the Tories down.
So how significant do you think that will be then, if we look into your crystal ball, the fact that not only have you got Farage leading a party which is going to be fielding candidates in all these Tory marginals, but that he's definitely not going to stand them down he says, as part of some deal with the Tories.
Well, it's huge because I think, forget the equation or the discussion about how many seats are Reform actually going to win. I think even with the Tories polling where they are, they're going to struggle to win even a handful, even if Farage's hopes come true and they get to 18 points. The bigger question is how many seats do the Tories bleed to Labour and even actually in the South East, potentially the Libs. How many seats are they going to lose because Reform has knocked another 10 points or another 15 points off their majority in those seats? And I think you could be looking at dozens and dozens of Conservative seats. There was some research done a few months ago by More in Common, a think tank, which suggested that if Reform hit between 15 and 20, it would lead to another 60 plus seats being lost by the Conservative Party. So we're already talking about potentially the biggest ever majority in history for Sir Keir Starmer. And I can tell you, his team will be popping champagne corks at the moment because his majority could now get a lot bigger.
Then there are seats like Clacton, where Farage is going to stand, which has history with Farageism in all its various different parties. What do you think might happen there?
Yeah, so Clacton's a fascinating seat. Forget the polling that Aaron Banks did. Clacton has a long backstory with Farage and his various parties. So in 2014, Douglas Carswell, who was then a Conservative MP and the MP for Clacton, he defected from the Tories to UKIP, which Farage was leading at the time. And this was the heyday period for UKIP. And then he called a by-election and he won. But the reason why Clacton's so fascinating is because people said, well, you know, it's a by-election, protest vote, they won't win again. But then when they held the 2015 general election, he retained his seat, and it was the only seat that UKIP ever won in a general election. So clearly, the voters in Clacton-on-Sea are receptive to what Nigel Farage is selling. He's already established there, and I think, therefore, it is the best seat he could possibly hope for.
We have got 4 weeks, pretty much, give or take, of this election campaign left. So there's lots that's going to happen. We've talked a lot about what Reform might do to the Tories on voting day. Between now and voting day, what do you think the impact will be on the Conservative Party?
Well, I think it's going to cause utter mayhem for MPs on the backbenches for Conservative Party. They're already going crazy overnight since he announced that he was coming back. I think you're going to start seeing a lot of Conservative MPs agitating even more for post-election for Farage to be brought back into the fold. Because if Reform are as successful as the polls are suggesting or Farage is suggesting, and they wipe out 6 million votes that would have otherwise gone Conservative, then for a Conservative Party that's going to be reduced to a rump of maybe 150 MPs, they will need to very urgently start making the steps to win those people back. And how better to do that than to bring the man that stole those votes away from them back into the fold. The problem that they've got, actually, the Conservative Party, is whether Farage wants to join the Tories. I mean, he said, I don't want to join the Conservative Party, I want to take it over. So if they do as well as he's hoping, he may think, actually, I don't need them, they need me, and they can come join my new entity, because he's talked about a potential merger or, as I say, takeover, and he's going to be thinking about 2029.
2029, next election.
Yeah. But to go back to your question about what's going on in the Conservative Party, I think what you'll also see, so MPs are getting very jittery. You can also be sure that in the CCHQ, where Rishi Sunak's team are based now, they are going to be having some serious conversations about their policy offerings in the manifesto. There's already reporting over the last 24 hours to suggest that the party is now having conversations about hardening up its stance on the European Convention on Human Rights. That's been an ongoing debate in the Conservative Party about whether we should stay in it, whether we should try to reform it, or whether we should leave altogether. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people around the Prime Minister making some very, very strong arguments to advocate for leaving because they will feel that's the only way they can go toe-to-toe with Farage, who has made immigration the entire focus, basically, of this election campaign.
What I can't understand, though, the square I can't circle, is the Conservative riposte to all of this, officially, is voting for Nigel Farage will make Keir Starmer's life more easy. It'll make it more likely that it has a big majority, and also it'll mean that a potential Conservative opposition will be smaller, maybe. Why would Farage want that to happen? Why would he want a world in which Sir Keir Starmer, who definitely doesn't want to leave the ECHR, who, to his mind, has a softer view on immigration, why would he want to help smooth his path to number 10?
Yeah, it's a question that lots of journalists have asked him, and his answer is simply that he doesn't believe the Conservative Party represents his values or the values of the Conservative Party, frankly, anymore. Lots of people who are close friends of his, and in fact, I talked to him about this, so he's a Thatcherite Conservative at heart. And they feel that the party has moved so far away from those ideals in the last 20 years that his line is that they're basically the same parties. You know, you can't put a cigarette paper between the Conservative Party and Labour. Lots of other people tell you that's not true, and there's quite significant differences on policy in key areas. But that's Farage's argument, that, you know, it doesn't matter if you vote Labour or the Tories, they're basically the same now. So what you need to do is vote for a party that will genuinely represent Conservative values.
Could this, like previous attempts of Nigel Farage to lead a party to some kind of victory and even get a seat himself in the Commons, come to absolutely zilch?
Yes, it totally could. They might not improve their polling. If they stay on 12%, then they're very unlikely to win any seats. If the Conservatives throw their all into preventing him from winning in Clacton, then he might not win. And then they would have very little to show for it in the end. But I think for Farage, he's decided after, you know, yo-yoing here and there over the last week to throw it all into it. So I think this is probably his last throw of the dice. I know he said he would stay on to lead for 5 years, but I genuinely think if he doesn't win this time, if he doesn't get elected, if Reform don't win any seats, then that's the time that he decides, right, and I know he's done this 3 or 4 times before, but right, I'm calling it a day for good. So you're totally right. It could all end up going to zilch. But then again, as we've seen over many years, Farage is always full of surprises.
And I tell you what, I've done it before. I'll do it again. I'll surprise everybody. Thank you.
That was Harry Yorke, the deputy political editor at the Sunday Times. Just last week, as he was explaining, Harry was in Skegness with Richard Tice and Nigel Farage as they were campaigning. You can read all about it at thetimes.com with a subscription. Nigel Farage is standing in Clacton at the election. So far, the other candidates standing are Giles Watling for the Conservative Party, Jovan Owusu-Nepaul for the Labour Party, Matthew Bensilum for the Liberal Democrats, and Natasha Osben for the Green Party. This is, of course, a big moment in the campaign. If you want more on the data and what this might look like for the Conservatives, Tom Calver, our data editor, has been looking into all of it at thetimes.com. And our news reporter, Constance Kampfner, is in Clacton, finding out what the reaction to all of this news has been there. You'll find that at thetimes.com with a subscription. We have more election episodes if you're after them. On Monday, Manveen heard how Keir Starmer went from being nicknamed Corbyn in a suit to a somewhat different leader that he is now. There's a link to that in the description of this episode. The producer today was Priyanka Deladia, the executive producer is Kate Ford, and sound design and theme tune are by Mao Lassetto Brito. Goodbye.